All right. So welcome back. So we're jumping into Saul as king. Just a refresher, we've talked about the few various times that Saul has been anointed as king. Uh, and last time we saw kind of Saul's coming into the role. We're kind of transitioning from just like some guy in a town taking care of his dad's or his dad's sheep to acting as king, for rallying the troops. What does it take to have a unifying national story? But from this point on, Saul is going to live into the role. The one thing that is interesting, I don't know how your Bibles deal with this, but at the beginning of chapter 13, my Bible is very explicit. There is missing words in the Hebrew here. So my verse 1 of 13 goes, Saul was blank 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 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for blank 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 number of year in 2 years over Israel.
Yeah.
Um, I'm just curious, how do your all's Bibles deal with that first verse there where mine has blanks? Yeah, Clay?
Yeah, my notes at the bottom say that Saul's age is not known, and then that some suppose that he reigned either 12 years or 22 years. So
Okay.
that number is either 10 or 20 plus 2.
Okay. Gary and Joanne, does yours actually fill in the numbers or is there blanks as well?
Well, it's confusing, but there's no blanks. It says Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel.
Okay.
It is confusing because when he'd reigned 1 year after he'd reigned two or something. So it is really kind of confusing if you try to interpret it literally.
Right. So what we can make out of this is there is a time jump where the previous story he's a younger man. I mean, it's one of those, if you had a patriarch that lived into old age, you were theoretically working for the family business for a long period of time. Like theoretically, his dad could be head of the household well into his later years, depending on how long he lived. We don't get any details of like when Saul got married, when Saul had kids. But we know by the time this next story hits, we are introduced to Jonathan, first just by name, but then we get the context clue that Jonathan is his son. Um, he has other kids, but Jonathan takes a center feature in this story and into the story of David. So we know that he has had at least time to get married, to have a son that is of adult age. We don't know if this was before his kingship. It's kind of assumed. I think 22 years is actually a good number because that would put Jonathan kind of into his young adult years, which makes sense with kind of how this story is about to play out. So we don't get 22 years worth of reign. We jump forward and hit Saul once again, going like having to deal with battle. But here's where we start to see Saul's downfall. We don't really get the good years, any like good kingly rule. We immediately jump from like coronation, his first act as king, to his first mistake. So the situation is set up by his son Jonathan defeating a garrison of Philistines, and then the Philistines preparing for retaliation. So Samuel is still in the picture. If you remember last time, he said, "Okay, I'm stepping back. I'm allowing King Saul to rule, but I'm still going to be the spiritual leader of the nation." And there's a situation where Samuel has not arrived. Samuel is supposed to do a sacrifice. He sent messengers saying he is going to do a sacrifice to like prepare the troops for battle. And it's getting to be the point where the troops are nervous enough that they're leaving. And so what do we think of this situation that Saul is in? Where on the one hand, He is king, he is leader, he's been given lots of responsibilities, and he sees that his troops are waning, but on the other hand, the spiritual heart of the nation and his mentor hasn't shown up yet. So what kind of things do we think are going through his head?
He's probably thinking, I have to do something.
Mm-hmm.
Can't wait any longer. And he either does not know the consequences of doing this priestly thing, or he knows it and feels he has no choice.
Mm-hmm.
Big mistake.
Yeah.
I kind of feel uncomfortable just piling on to Saul because he was in a situation. I think it would be reasonable to give him some credit to knowing what needed to be done and getting on with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where this is one of those where his decision is very human and in some ways very reasonable. He is thinking about the well-being of his people. He is trying to do what's best. He's trying to be a good leader. And he's like, okay, like, it's not that he's like going into battle without God. He's like, I need God on my side. Something seems to have happened. Time to take action. Like in some ways, yeah, that is, or Gary, I think that's a very valid point of, in some ways, he's being an excellent leader. He's doing what needs to be done. At the same time, he is also crossing a boundary. So if we were to put this into a debate club, and that's the pro Saul argument of like, look, great leader, in a crisis situation, he did what he thought he had to do to prepare everyone to protect his people. Great leader. What's on the other side? The kind of the side that's saying, well, he overstepped. He may have been trying, but he shouldn't have done this. What's kind of on the other side of the argument?
Well, it first depends, did he know that doing this would cause him to lose the kingdom?
He
You know,
probably
did
didn't
he know
know
this?
that it would lose him the kingdom. He should have known that it's not permissible. He didn't have permission to do this. No.
But would he have known that it wouldn't be forgiven? And the consequence is, sorry, we've got the Lord has somebody else in mind.
Nope. He did not know the consequences.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's hard to make decisions when you don't have both sides of the equation. It's not like he's weighing pro cons list of like my role as king versus the well-being of my people. That equation is kind of unknown. What are thinking back to some of the other like battles that we've seen in the story so far, when has the battle gone well? Like what are some of the features when the people do well in the previous battles?
Well, you had God right with you on some of them, using things like earthquakes and to that extreme.
Right. There's a certain point where this God is a warrior God, and so God will act in battle. So what happens before some of those are like the iconic God sowed chaos in the enemy troops. There was commotion and there's fear. What was some of the features of those battles that led up to that? So thinking back to like, especially some like what happened with some of the judges, or um which I believe, wait, let's see which one. I believe it is Gideon, where God is, okay, I'm gonna fight for you, but let everyone who's afraid go home. Okay, now take them to the water, the edge of the water, and people who drink by using their hands, let them go home. Do you all remember what some of the logic behind letting some people who didn't want to fight go home was for that situation?
I can't remember any of that.
It makes the battle more efficient because you don't have people in the way that don't want to be there.
Right.
So
So yeah, so there's an efficiency. You're whittling it down to like the most fearsome warriors. There's the other side of it from like the religious side of it, if you all remember that argument.
Oh yeah, the arbitrator.
so you're putting aside a certain populace to keep the culture going.
Mm-hmm.
If things don't go your way.
So another good example um is with the Battle of Jericho. If you remember, this is the first battle they fight in the book of Joshua, where they're told, you're going to walk around the city. For 6 days, you're going to blow a bunch of horns, and that's it. And then on the seventh day, you're all going to go around and you're going to give a really big shout, and then the city's going to come into your hands. So there was a specific feature of why they did this. Like, why do this as opposed to just attack the city?
Hmm.
It was like a morale thing, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Clay, any thoughts? Joanne?
Come on, Joanne.
You don't have to talk if you don't want to, Joanne. Don't worry.
If you're walking around, they're going to be a little bit used to you, and probably you've made some eye contact with a few people, and you don't seem as threatening unless you're marching, in a angry, aggressive way. If you're just marching through town, it might be a surprise attack, more of a surprise attack. They don't expect you to attack.
Mm-hmm.
At least they don't know when. More?
No.
No? Okay. So one of the features we've talked about that I'm going to remind you all of is a lot of these battles have impossible odds. The situation is set up. So if it was just a human versus human battle, the Israelites would lose by all intents and purposes. Like they're constantly presented as the underdog. In the Battle of Jericho, they're not fighting on equal terms because like the people, they're just walking around. In the story of Gideon, they have like 300 men. If I remember my numbers correct, and just the odds are not in their favor. And there's a bunch of other battles where God intentionally lowers the amount of people fighting because God wants to make sure that human beings are not getting the credit for the battle. That if God is fighting for them, God wants to make sure that people know that this is happening because God is doing it, not because humans are doing it. So knowing that that's a feature in a lot of these other stories, how does that perspective reflect on the story of Saul, where Saul's all of a sudden seeing a lot of people leave, and he is worried that he's going to lose the battle because the people are leaving?
Yeah. Again, it goes back to what Gary said. He has to make a decision
Mm-hmm.
to continue as the leader.
Right. But if he was aware of Gideon's story, where God intentionally reduced the amount of people at his sides, what would be the correct decision based on the other stories?
Well, Gideon ends up dying. So ends up being killed.
I think he lives. Gideon doesn't get killed in battle, I don't.
Yeah, that's later. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that the result of
Yeah.
making?
No. Gideon wins the battle with a small number of people.
Right.
So the toss-up is here. Do you trust raw numbers? Do you trust your military know-how? Do you trust the men that are in front of you? Or do you trust God that even with reduced numbers, if God is on your side, you will win?
I think based on the past things, you need to be trusting God.
So that's kind of the toss-up of God is, Saul is theoretically capitulating to the way things are done. Like he's like, okay, I know for this to go well, I need God on my side, so I'm going to do the sacrifices. And theoretically, in his mind, he gets to keep God's blessing and presence in battle and numbers. And in his mind, that's the best formula. Versus do the ritual correctly, and God is powerful enough to win even with less people.
But I can understand why he panicked, because he was aware of the Philistines being in great numbers and they're all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And his group, every morning there's fewer of them left.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, there's that feeling. I mean, that is one of those very human feelings of I am trying to do the right thing, but the right thing is I'm waiting for something that I'm told is gonna come, but it looks like the window of opportunity is closing. Like it's getting smaller and smaller, and I am worried. Not to mention in verse 5, verse 5, we get a description of the Philistines. I've gone through this before, but a quick reminder, the Philistines were technologically far more advanced. The Israelites are still mostly in the Iron Age. Iron Age, where the Philistines are in the Bronze Age. They are at two different stages of development. The Israelites do not have the technology they do. And also, they have chariots. They have 30,000 chariots. And chariots are expensive. Horses are expensive. So they have 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops like the sands on the seashore. So they have a lot of people. They have a lot of people that can run laps around them on animals that go really fast, and they have a lot of men in basically armored boxes who go very fast. The Israelites would have been majority on foot. They would have had spears and farming implements, but it's only Saul and his son Jonathan really have swords. And so if you see the power differential, where not only are you going up against a lot of troops, but you're going up against a lot more technologically advanced troops.
Yeah.
I will.
Oh, and also that right after knowing all of that, the verses that came next, I don't remember this in other battles. They are really scared. They're hiding in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns, or they're crossing the Jordan and getting out of there. I mean, it's really really desperate.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was quite a description of
Right.
what they're facing and what their reaction is.
Yeah. Now, mind you, so a quick description of the landscape. The area where they're talking about, there is a lot of natural caves. It is a desert region, but it's also it's made out of a very porous rock. And so there's just a lot of little nooks and crannies to hide in the hills and the mountains. So That's why it's like cisterns and like they're hiding in rocks and caves. There's a lot of those little nooks and crannies.
But I just don't remember a description like this before of where the people went.
Right. Yeah,
So,
the other ones, they're like, oh, we don't want to fight, or oh, we don't have that many numbers. This is one where people are fleeing.
mhm. Yeah.
Um, so the other detail to know about the Philistines, they are a seafaring culture, but they come from the Greek Isles. So this is basically the expansion of the Greek culture. So instead of I feel like half the time the Philistines are depicted as like knuckle dragging Neanderthals that are backwards. It's actually quite the reverse. It's
Mhm.
a better image. This is not perfect, but it's like an extension of Athens or Sparta. Like it's a proto though that side of the culture that they're facing up against. It is Greek warfare that is arriving. So yeah, hide. This is terrifying.
And my book mentions that Saul would have had 600 men with him as a realistic estimate of who had remained.
Mm-hmm.
It's a huge, huge difference.
Mm-hmm. Right. So Saul takes things into his own hands, does what he thinks he needs to do, does the sacrifice of well-being, and just as he finishes, that's when Samuel walks up and goes, "Hey, buddy, what did you just do?"
Yeah.
Which dramatic irony. Like if he had waited just a little bit longer, things would have fallen into place. But he was anxious enough, he did it just before his mentor arrived. And um his explanation, so he is very open with what he just did. He tells Samuel immediately, when I saw the people were slipping away from me and you didn't come. There was a window of time. You told me you would come. You didn't come. And so I was worried in like the morale of the people. So I did the sacrifice and have asked God for help. You didn't come, so I did it myself.
Well, and he also mentions that, yeah, that the Philistines had mustard. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, but you're right. The timing is very ironic. That if he had just waited,
Mm-hmm.
but just waited how long? An hour? I mean, what does just after mean? Does
Right.
it mean he just had finished, or does it mean a day later?
Mm-hmm.
Or
So do we see this as Saul taking ownership for his actions, or is he in some ways blaming Samuel? Like, where were you? Like, I had to do this. Where were you?
I got it as blaming Samuel.
Well, I got it more as an explanation of why he felt he had to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but in that explanation, he said, "You did not come at the appointed time." So that puts it right back on Samuel. Here's why I had to do it.
That was a fact. He didn't
Yeah,
show up when he said he would.
yeah. So
I'm just trying to give Clay a hard time.
yeah, but this is not Saul's fault, you know.
See, and this is why I have compassion for him or sympathy for him is he's not trying to hide what he did.
Mhm.
He's just upfront. It's like, here's what I did. Unfortunately, in the way that we've seen before, where it seems like the punishment is outsized for the action. Um, it kind of reminds me of how Moses is punished for like striking the rock twice instead of once and then can't go into the promised land. This is one of those that Saul is trying to be faithful. He is doing he's like, I did my best. I did what I thought I had to do. And Samuel's still like, yeah, but you didn't follow all of the instructions. And so, yeah, you're not going to be, you're not going to have the dynasty. It's not the, you're going to die right now, but it's still, you're not going to inherit the kingdom, or your sons are not going to.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, in verse 14, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord has commanded you. So how do we feel about that?
Pretty final. There's no coming back from this one. And my Bible says that the person is David.
It is, yeah.
So that's going to be real hard to come back from.
So here is one of the things that I think from this point forward, it is very important to keep in mind. What is the traditional, or the saying that people like to say about who writes history? History is written by
The winners.
The winners. We already see here, Saul is not going to be the winner overall, which means who has collected this history?
Oh, let's see, where is that? Early source. Mine says something about early source.
Mm-hmm. So,
and then some of this is interrupted in early source, so.
The earliest version of these stories will be put down during either King David's reign or King David's children's reign.
Okay.
It is important to know that Saul's stories are edited by the Davidic monarchy. And it is important to know that in this text here, because this is one, we're going to get some stories that are very clearly biased towards David. And it starts almost automatically, where we don't really get any of King Saul's exploits. We don't really hear about anything else he did. We just hear he mustered troops into battle and did his first act as king, and then it fast forwards until he messes up. The person writing it down has an agenda. We are going to see this again and again. Part of the reason King Saul has a very bad reputation is because the monarchy has an agenda, and it is very present in this story. And so, what incentive does the Davidic monarchy have in writing Samuel's critique the way it does? If you're looking at this as a piece of propaganda, what does it do?
It shores up the need to follow God's word and instructions precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And even sometimes you got to read between the lines.
Right. The question is, does David do this in the end? That's going to be a different question. Hold on to that one. Saul is punished for not following directions. There's an implicit, comment about David's line and whether they follow directions or not. But we're told that Saul's line does not follow directions. They are being punished because they did not follow directions. What other things do we see that might be a viewpoint baked into this critique? So David and his line is not named right now, but how is it described?
A man after his own, that the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart.
So why is Saul chosen as king?
Yeah, why was he chosen?
Do you remember in the story when there is both when he walked up on Samuel, but also when he was chosen in king, what are people remarking about? He's tall and he's handsome, right?
Yeah, I'm looking back at that, and that's basically it. Yeah.
Yeah, Gary, what were you about to say?
That's a tall, handsome, and he apparently didn't have any skeletons in the closet, as we use the term today.
Uh-huh.
He'd been leading a clean life or whatever.
Right. So he was tall. Oh, hey, Larry.
Larry's back.
We're still in chapter 13. We might actually just stick in 13 right now. We're talking about Samuel coming down hard on King Saul here.
Okay, gotcha.
So we know that Saul comes from a rich family. He has a lot of resources. He's a good guy. Comes from good breeding, good stock. He's tall and he's handsome. And that's kind of his qualifications. Now, he does the role, and he's, for 22 years, evidently, he's doing an okay enough job.
Mhm.
But in this critique, God doesn't say, okay, well, we chose someone taller and more handsome than you, King Saul. We're given this description that the next person is going to be chosen for his heart.
Yeah, gotcha.
So what does that prepare you for as you go, like we know at this point, Saul's line's not gonna last.
Yeah.
What are you anticipating next then?
More wars.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So David continues. It's in the book of Samuel, though, that we're going to see David.
I mean, let's see. David comes. Let's see. David enters the scene in chapter 16.
Yeah.
So we have about, I mean, we're in 13 right now, so 3 more chapters and David's going to appear. So Saul and David have a lot of interaction. And so by this little verse here, why I'm fixating on it is because it is already presenting us with a point of view and telling us how to react. Larry, to catch you up, the point I brought up a little bit ago was that the stories of 1st and 2nd Samuel were likely first written down during the Davidic monarchy. We don't know if David's people wrote it down or David's like children or grandchildren, but there is a point of view that is baked into this. We've already talked about how the people editing it in exile didn't like kings, and we've talked about that. But the next point of view is some of this is royal propaganda. And when it comes to certain parts of it, I have some hilarious comments from my professors to share with you all. One that I find hilarious, but it is very clearly some of this is propaganda, and it is monarchy propaganda about the rulers at the time. And so by talking about, hey, Saul did this thing and it cost him the kingdom, he is told by Samuel, the stand-up, bang-up guy, the prophet who did nothing wrong. Remember, he told them he's never taken a bribe. He has no horse in the race. He's just trying to do his best job. And the bang-up prophet who did no wrong says that Saul did not deserve to keep the kingdom and his line is going to end. So how is that priming us to read the rest of the story when things get worse? Do we feel bad for Saul? Are we supposed to feel bad for Saul?
I think we're supposed to feel good for the future. But I don't know. And of course, I don't know how David will be introduced, but he's a shepherd, right? We're not talking rich family or talking a whole different person. I'm thinking this just is getting us just a tiny hint for the future for the leader.
Well, I'm always going to have some sympathy for Saul. I think he was set up here. I don't think, it wasn't too long ago that they were in a pinch. They would drop back and start worshiping other gods. At least Saul was on track here. He was going right to the one God. So I feel
Right. So why I'm calling this propaganda is because we see this throughout history. If another family takes power, one of the first things they do is defame the other royals. Like in Egyptian history, one thing that we see a couple of times is there's a few women who rise to power, the most famous one being Hatshepsut, who ruled as a pharaoh, and the moment she dies, she is erased. They took chisels and chiseled her name out of the hieroglyphics. They defamed her in every way possible. It is thought that a lot of the stories of Cleopatra were actually meant to defame her, and they're not actually accurate. They're a lot of times when another person takes power to cement your rule, what you say is that person was really bad. Feel lucky that I'm in power. And so that's why I say that there's a bit of propaganda here, because I think Saul was dealt a difficult hand. And I think David, even if it's not David himself, David's line has an incentive to make Saul look really bad. Because he was the first chosen monarch. And so if your family is the second monarchy, how do you cement your legitimacy? As you have a right to rule, how do you defame the first chosen monarch of the people? So if you're trying to discredit the first guy, what are some of the things you're going to do?
Show that he made bad decisions.
Bad decision maker. This guy had terrible judgment. Other things you would do to discredit a previous leader.
Also defame his family members.
So we would expect that not only King Saul is going to go down, we're expecting Jonathan's going to have a downfall. Other things that you would do to make a previous leader look bad.
Well, you could say he misused the funds of the country, or misused something or other, didn't do something right.
So abused power to enrich himself.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can also rewrite the history of the battle.
To
make them look, completely more exaggerated, more lopsided.
Although they did give Saul pretty good credit for being a good general, did they not? As far as winning, at least.
Well, this next battle in chapter 14, it's a long explanation of it, and it does undercut Saul. I don't know how much we're going to get into it today, because but it is good and bad at the same time. The other one is questioning the mental stability, and this one is going to come into play majorly with Saul. Is he a stable person? Can you rule if you are unstable? And does that instability have other effects? So like questioning the mental state of the leader.
Oh, yeah.
So keep those things in mind, because almost all of the things we mentioned are going to come into play with Saul's reign. We already get here that we are told that like this is not going to last. The writers of the story have every incentive to play up the fact that it's like, well, it's not the next guy's fault that he was chosen by God as the leader. Saul made a bad decision, and it's Saul's fault that his family does not continue as the monarchy. So the story has the writers of the story have every incentive to make Saul look bad, to make you not sympathetic towards him, and to kind of blame it all on him. It is Saul's fault that Saul has a downfall.
Okay.
So that's just something we need to be aware of. I'm not saying that these things didn't happen, but some parts are likely exaggerated or biased. The writers of these stories are biased. So there will be many a points going forward from this point on that I'm going to ask, is this history or is this propaganda?
Okay.
It's going to be our new game of what is propaganda.
Oh,
So that said, Samuel kind of chews Saul out and then he leaves. He's like, okay, I'm not even doing the sacrifice. You already did it. I'm out. Have fun with the battle.
okay.
Saul counted 600 men remaining. Never mind that there's thousands of people on the Philistine side and they have chariots and weapons and a bunch of good stuff. We have the additional issue that evidently all of the smiths have been killed or done away with. So that the Hebrew people have to go to the Philistines to sharpen their weapons. That is a major blow. That is actually a very efficient way to cripple a military, is take away their ability to deal with their weapons. And so that sets us up for the beginning of the battle that's about to take place. So how do we feel going into this next battle? Are things looking good or bad?
Really bad.
And it is sort of a strange circumstance. I mean, you can't, it's hard to imagine who engineered the disappearance of all the smithies. So there aren't any available to sharpen the weapons. You know, some of these things just sound sort of implausible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and my book says that it's an editor who kind of writes this to make the situation worse than it actually is.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Once again, is it history or is it propaganda?
Yeah, a little embellishment.
Right. So knowing that I'm already probably going to redo some of the schedule for the December and going forward, do we want to jump into 14? Because I know 14's really long, or do we want to kind of just wrap it up here for now? Wrap it up here. Okay.
Yeah, I think we ought to wrap it up because 14 is a long chapter, plus we're only at half staff here.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I was going to just make one more little comment or ask. We don't see any other things that Saul does. You mentioned we just jump right forward. So we have no other examples of decisions he's made.
Mm-hmm.
It's done before this one happens.
Mm-hmm.
That just occurred to me that we really don't have any prior things as we're arguing or debating. Did he make a good choice here or did he make a bad choice when he mistake? That just occurred to me. We actually have nothing else before that.
So I asked the question,
Mhm.
why?
Yeah.
Why
that's-
would the text be absent of any other context clues about Saul's reign?
Right.
Mhm.
And it just makes this, it just exacerbates how this looks.
Mhm.
Yeah. By leaving all that out.
So we have a few context clues, a little bit to think about what happened in the intermediate years between young Saul and middle-aged Saul.
Mhm.
So Saul is getting ready for battle, and he is waiting for Samuel to do a sacrifice. What does that imply about how things have gone in the past?
He's never done it. Samuel has.
But there is a likelihood that there hasn't been just 22 years of peace. Him and
Oh,
the
right.
Philistine, like it is well known, the Philistines and the Israelites go toe to toe all the time. They are like constantly battling. So if Saul is waiting for Samuel to do the thing, and there seems to be an implied assumption that like Samuel, this is what Samuel does, it implies that in the past, what has happened?
That Saul shows up to prepare the troops.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It implies that Saul has been very reliant on Samuel to do this job.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It kind of implies that he always waits for the he does a regular sacrifice. He waits for Samuel to do it. They have agreed upon time. It sounds, by the context clues, it sounds like this is something very normal.
Yeah.
Which means, what is the implied relationship between Saul and Samuel up to this point?
Mhm.
I don't know what the right word is. Not cooperation, but
Mhm.
their parts in the ritual. No.
Yeah. They are reliant on, or like Saul is
Reliant.
reliant on Samuel.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, reliant, that was the word.
Reliant.
One's waiting for the other, as is customary. It's the way it's always been.
Mhm.
It's always worked.
Yeah. Saul's going to be the instrument that does things, but he's got to have Samuel's blessing, sort of, in order, before he does anything.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The ritual of the burnt offering and all of that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. One of the other like subtle context clues is this evidently is done enough that Saul knows what to do.
Yeah, he said he waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. So that occurred to me also. This has happened before.
Mhm.
This is how it had always worked.
Mm.
But Saul does not have religious training, which means he has
Yeah, he
watched
can't teach
Samuel
it.
do the sacrifice, so he knows. He has seen how it happens. He knows the words. He he has done this enough. It makes me think of how I learned to cook. I learned to cook by watching my mom. There are some recipes that never got written down that still I don't have a written version of. I just do it because I watched her do it. And
Mm.
it sounds like Saul has seen this enough and they've done this working relationship enough. He knows what to do, which means they've done this frequently, which so all of these subtle implications have a what kind of relationship would you expect these two to have? Like how close, how friendly, how like what would how would they treat each other, do you think? If they're doing this seemingly frequently.
Well, Saul would defer to Samuel for this, and Samuel would be deferring to Saul to be the leader of the military.
Mhm.
They would have their defined roles and would work together.
So they were cooperative, and they're partners in leading
Mhm.
the country.
Yeah,
partners.
and whether or
No,
not they like one another is hard to determine.
It'd actually be irrelevant as long as
Yeah,
you follow.
yeah, right. Well, probably irrelevant as far as the outcome is concerned,
mhm.
you know, but sort of
So there is
interesting.
going to be a I'm asking some of these questions because I know where the story goes, and there's other implications of like the relationship between these two. So there is an age gap between them. Samuel's already pretty old by this point,
Yeah.
and Samuel's pretty old, and Saul is kind of this young king. And we get context clues later on that Saul has been using Samuel as like a guiding mentor.
Mm,
That while he is king, he is deferring to Samuel's wisdom and constantly like asking. There seems to be a source of wisdom that Samuel provides,
mm,
which is kind of goes into the age gap kind of, because Samuel has functionally been ruling where Saul, not trained for the job, has no leadership experience. And so
mhm,
there tends to be an assumption that there is a mentor-mentee relationship between these two,
mm, mm. Okay.
which kind of going into some of the implications of like seeing glimmers of this relationship, having Larry, what we started off by is in verse 1, there is numbers missing, so we don't
Yes.
really know the time gap, but it's
Yeah.
to be around 22 years
Okay.
because that's around how old we think Jonathan is. Because we don't
Okay.
hear about Saul getting married, we don't hear about him having a son. All of a
Yeah.
sudden, he just has
Yeah.
an adult son. It's kind of implied that it's around 22 years.
Yeah. They were so careful with numbers. I mean, they're telling you how many men are on this side. Where did those numbers go? They couldn't even write down how long he ruled.
Once again, is it a historical mistake or is it propaganda?
Uh,
There may be some reasons why those numbers got intentionally left out.
yeah.
The other hard thing is that our number system that we know today comes from
Mm,
Arabic. We have Arabic
mhm,
numbers. In the Hebrew world, they just have the alphabet, and the alphabet doubles as their numbers.
okay.
So, another interesting random factoid doesn't have to deal with the story. Our term alphabet comes from aleph bet, which are the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
Oh,
So they just used the number or their letters as numbers. And so it can get a little bit confusing, so it may have been left out because they thought there was an extra letter there.
mm,
Anyways, so theoretically, if Saul had a really close relationship with Samuel, if they've been doing this on and off, theoretically, Saul has been a good king. And his details are left out because his family did not, or his family all died early. That I'm going to give you a preview. Everyone dies, and it's not pretty. And so Saul's line dies out. There's no one to keep the annals of his monarchy, and David's line has no incentive to put it in the text because they
mm,
want Saul to look bad because David's line is more legitimate the worse Saul is. So
mm,
theoretically, for the time jump, he's actually a pretty good king.
mm,
So this is why I see Saul as kind of a tragic character more than anything.
mm.
He's good in some ways and has a downfall where he plays a villain in the story, but I see him more as someone who is cast as the villain more than someone who wants to be a villain.
Mm.
So, Gary, I appreciate that you have all compassion for Saul because so do I, because he has this kind of where he
Poor
is
Saul.
legitimately, I believe, trying his best. He just overstepped in one scenario and pays a hefty price for it. So any final thoughts on Saul and the beginning of his downfall here? Alrighty. Thank you all for bearing with me. I know it feels kind of like a transition, but this is also a transition of perspective that I really wanted to make sure we understood going forward and kind of where we are heading. So we are fast approaching David and how David is going to interact with Saul. So, all right. With that note, I'm going to reorient some of our reading dates, get us through January, because I'm going to have some time off, and then we can some very interesting stories are up ahead. So
Okay. Yeah, okay.
It's been only taken us through today. I think on your last,
really?
yeah. So, and it was 13, 14. So yeah, it's a good time to reorganize.
All right, sounds good. All right, well, shall I pray us out for today?
Mhm.
All right. Gracious and loving God, sometimes it's hard when we look at scripture that we consider holy, that we consider your message to us, and we have the reality that your words and your guidance comes to us through history, through many human hands. Even though some of these stories are written by people with agendas, that are written from particular human perspectives, that have human fingerprints all over it. Help us remember that even though it's hard to find the truth in all of that, it's a reminder to us that you work with us. You work with us to tell your story. You work with us in the world to enact your story. You work with us in all things. That even on our worst days when we are imperfect, you still choose to work with us and through us. And so help us lean into that. Help us make the decisions the best we can, even when we make mistakes like Saul. We're told that you are a forgiving God, a God of grace and mercy, that you won't abandon us. So help us lean in, help us trust you, and help us continue in the work you have laid out before us. I ask you that you bless this group for whether we are traveling or staying at home, that we may have abundant Thanksgivings and be reminded of your grace and blessing in our world today. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right.
Thank you, Chris, and
Thanks, Chris.
luck with your
Thank you all. See you all next week.
Okie dokie.